very special guest. His name is Dr. Andrew Hayes, and he's a tenured associate professor of theology and division dean of liberal studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. And he also is a contributor to a book that I recently co-edited called Eastern Christian Approaches to Philosophy. And he specializes in the Syriac patristics and is very interested in particular in St Ephrem the Syrian. And that was the subject of his contribution to the book that we put out. So today we're going to ask the question, was St Ephrem opposed to philosophy? Andrew, I wonder if you could begin by just providing us with a brief introduction to St Ephrem, as for those who may not be familiar with him, and provide us with some information about when he lived, some of the things he wrote, some interesting facts about his life.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and thanks so much for the opportunity. So I'm always eager to find times to talk about St Ephrem the Syrian. So who was St Ephrem? Well, he was an exact contemporary of St Athanasius. That means that he lived in the 4th century. We don't know exactly when he was born, but the usual dates that are given are from about 306 to 373. And St Ephrem is really an interesting figure in the history of the early church because he's really the founder. I think it's fair to call him this, even though he's not the first. He's the most important early author within the Syriac Christian tradition. So he lives in Mesopotamia, in what is today Turkey, but it's really in that border area between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And so that's his native land. His native language was a dialect of Aramaic spoken by the Christians, and we call that dialect Syriac, at least modern scholars do, although it goes by a few other names. It has its own script and very vibrant literary tradition, mostly theological writing that starting in about the 2nd century or so. But Ephrem's really the most important early author within that tradition. He really kind of establishes its characteristic themes and features, both in terms of its genres and its vocabulary. And he is also a poet. So all of his theological writing, well, I shouldn't say all, nearly all of his theological writing is in poetic form. And so he's very different from, at least when you first read him, when people first encounter him, he's very different from the Greek fathers with whom he is a contemporary. So, Athanasius is famous for having written treatises on the incarnation and a treatise against the Gentiles, or the orations against the Arians, letters, things like that. Almost all of Ephrem's theological writings are very symbolic in character, and they are these stanzaic poems called madrashe, or is another way of pronouncing that, depending on how you pronounce the particular dialect of Syriac, madroshe. And we don't know for absolute certain how these madrashe were used, but it's clear that some of them, in fact, many of them were used in the liturgy, in the liturgical services. Ephrem himself seems to have been a deacon and a catechist and a choir director, if we may use that term. Some of the madrashe are arguably more classroom-oriented pieces. So there's kind of a wide range of what we might call styles or tones in the poetry itself. And we have about, if memory serves, about 450 extant madrashe from St Ephrem, so it's a very large corpus. And he also wrote some what we might call metrical discourses. Those are also known as memre. And he has some prose works, including a few commentaries. So there's a lot of different things, but his really signature characteristic is his articulation of the faith and his defense of the true faith in poetic and symbolic terms, with a language, with a vocabulary, theological vocabulary, which is very sacramental in character, and it's very different from the sort of philosophically tinged discourse that you get from late antique church fathers like Athanasius, or even perhaps more to the point, like Gregory of Nyssa. So that's I would say, if you want to understand his theology, I would say it's a theology of wonder. He really insists upon the thesis that our only path to the knowledge of God is through the symbols in which God reveals himself in nature and scripture, and our ability to receive those symbols really depends upon the being in the state of wonder. So it's what I think Ephrem gives to us is a theology which resembles Athanasius in some of its major themes. Like he's interested in some of the same themes, like the relationship between God and the world. He's concerned about the Arian crisis because he's living in that exact same time, and yet he really puts the accent on on a way to approach the divine mystery that is grounded in wonder. And so there's also a really beautiful Syriac mystical tradition and later Syriac spirituality, and you can see that it really draws its depth and its life from this wellspring of wonder that is characteristic of St. Ephrem. So now, all that being said, we don't actually know a great deal about his life. There are later accounts, but they've been proven to be unreliable. He was not a monk in the traditional sense, even though you'll see him depicted as such in Orthodox icons. He was, beyond the fact that what we know of his own references to himself, he seems to have been a deacon, seems to have been a catechist and a choir director. We know that he served his bishops in his native city of Nisibis before being forced in 363, he was forced to flee to Edessa as a result of the failed military campaign of Julian the Apostate. And so the whole Christian population, or at least much of the Christian population, was granted safe passage. That the city was ceded to the Persians as part of the peace treaty, and the Christians were granted safe passage to go west to Edessa. They didn't want to be under Persian rule because at the time the emperor was, or the empire was much more friendly to Christianity than the Persian domains were. So there's a bit more that could be said. I just want to add one more thing because it often comes up for people that aren't familiar with Ephrem. There is a later hagiographical tradition and a large number of texts that are in Greek that are ascribed to him, and there are stories about him visiting St. Basil and things like this. These are probably not true. And so it's important, as we're thinking about Ephrem and who he is and what he wrote, that we not get confused by the very interesting, very large and influential corpus of Greek works associated with his name, because most of them are not by him. There's some relationship with certain particular texts. But what I think a lot of scholars found fascinating about Ephrem was his being very different from the Greek patristic tradition, his being very close to Jewish exegetical traditions as well, and just this vibrant symbolic poetry, which gave us another vision of what patristic theology could look like. So with that, I've kind of come full circle to where I began the answer to this question. So I think that's a good place to pause.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. That's a fantastic overview of who St. Ephrem is and who we're dealing with in his writings. So, okay, some people believe that he was an anti-intellectual and that he is, opposed to philosophy. So why is it that people believe this?
Well, it's I think there are two factors, the most important of which is some of the things that Ephrem himself said about Greeks and about things that seem to be referring to Greek philosophers. And the other factor is, I think, a little bit of what we might call Harnakian prejudice. And so I'll start with that second thing first. People approaching St. Ephrem are often impressed by that difference that I mentioned, how different his attitude, his demeanor, his poetry is from things that they've encountered before. They're impressed by his apparent Jewishness. And so there's this desire to think, oh gosh, here is this Semitic theology that's very different from the Hellenistic form that it takes among the other fathers, the Greek and Latin fathers. And so I think that there's sort of predisposition towards that view based on a division between Hellenism and Judaism. Now, I think the more important or more relevant factor contributing to this view is that Ephrem himself says some disparaging things about Greek wisdom in a few places. And so, like, for example, in his very famous hymns on the faith, his Midrashe on the faith, most of them are dedicated to anti-Arian type themes. They're very concerned with questions about how we can know God, questions about the divinity of the Son of God, things like that. And in the course of those texts, specifically in Midrasha number 2, verse 24, if memory serves, he says, "Blessed is the one who has not tasted of the poison of the wisdom of the Greeks." and that's literally what it says. Merta de Hachmatha de Yalnaye. Okay, Yalnaye, Ionians, being the Syriac word for Greeks. Okay, and so he basically has this very harsh criticism of Greek wisdom, whatever that means, right? And it doesn't stand alone. It's not like it's just one thing that he says, because much of his writing is very concerned with what he calls the investigators, the basoye in Syriac. These and exactly what he means by the investigators, you have to glean from his writings. It's almost like if you lived in his parish, I bet you would know what he was talking about a little bit more. He doesn't feel like he has to explain himself all the time, but it appears to be really he's really opposed to those who have a kind of presumptuous intellectual attitude in their desire for defining God and defining divine mystery. He's very opposed to any attempts to define God. And now, here's the thing, right? A lot of the Greek fathers would totally agree with that. But I think you add to it the fact that he's writing in this weird language, maybe, and in this new format, and using language which is all biblical and doesn't seem to have any obvious philosophical pedigree. And people, even though he's got very much the same message as, say, Gregory Nazianzen, when it comes to the inadmissibility of defining divine mystery, and like just for example, right? If we read Gregory Nazianzen's first theological oration, in which he talks about when is it appropriate to speak of God and how is it appropriate to speak of God, these are all the same concerns that Ephrem has, at least thematically, but Ephrem really stands out as someone who seems to have got a completely different approach because of the genre and literary tradition in which he's writing. And so you put those two things together, and the fact that Ephrem says some disparaging things about Greeks, including he actually mentions Plato occasionally, and almost never in a good, actually never, I think, in a good way. So you put these little remarks together with the overall insistence upon the evil of investigation, and it's easy to see how somebody reading him might be led to this idea that he's anti-intellectual. Happily, that view, which used to be more common among scholars, is starting to give way to a better interpretation, and it's due to the work of many that have said, "Oh no, wait a minute, hold on." He says these things, but it's also pretty clear that he's indebted to the Greek philosophical tradition, particularly in his prose works, and so we've got to have a more nuanced answer to this question. We can't simply put it in terms of antagonism between the Syriac tradition and Greek learning, which was kind of the older model. And I think some of it is also that it depends on what you think theology is supposed to be. If you think theology requires a certain precision of language, and you can't seem to and you really want to insist upon that requiring a certain way of talking that Ephrem doesn't use, then he's going to come off as maybe more pietistic. But I think that's a reflection of pre-existing prejudices, and it's not unique to Ephrem. I mean, his successor Jacob of Sarug, who's a 6th century figure and a theological poet, he also gets the same criticisms there's this, I could go on, but I probably shouldn't. So the idea, it's a viewpoint that has a long history in the study of the Syriac tradition. And I think it's just taking a little bit of time for scholars to come to how to answer the puzzle of the seeming tension in the writings, but also coming to recognize that the Semitic Hellenistic divide is probably not the best paradigm to be using.
Yeah, well, let's try to talk about that tension then. So, you've already pointed out that there's a shift in the paradigm, and scholars are starting to realize maybe that one on this far side of the pendulum, that he's a complete anti-intellectual. Maybe that interpretation is not great, and obviously he's not some Greek philosopher. That's very clear.
He's very different from Origen.
Right. But in your contribution to the book, Eastern Christian Approaches to Philosophy, you do talk about the fact that St Ephrem reacted to and borrowed from ideas and themes found in late antique philosophy. And so, I was curious, what kind of evidence do we have that he did that?
Yeah, for anyone who's listening, the important work on this was done by Ute Possekel. She wrote her dissertation, I believe it's just called The Evidence of Greek Philosophical Concepts in the Writings of St. Ephrem the Syrian. It was a very straightforward title. And she very effectively and very systematically goes through his corpus and finds the clear traces of the conceptual legacy of the late antique philosophical tradition. Where do we find that in particular? Really, we ought to have her on to answer this question, but if I could sort of sum up what she has discovered in her writing, and this dissertation was written in 1999, by the way, so it's what does that make it, about 24 years old? In scholarly terms, it's not like brand new, but it's still kind of a young work, I think, since scholarship on the Syriac tradition stretches over a much longer period of time. So what she discovered was that particularly in his prose treatises, the so-called prose refutations of Mani, Bardaisan, and Marcion, these are the most important heresiarchs or arch heretics of the day for the articulation of the true faith. And it's often the case that that among the fathers, we find them kind of defining and expressing what the Orthodox faith is in the light of errors about it, right? And so for Ephrem, the important foils were Marcion, Bardaisan, and Mani. And so he wrote these refutations of these works. And in the course of these refutations, we find him borrowing concepts from Greek philosophy, particularly theories of the elements, theories about what might be called cosmology. He clearly knows like the Stoic theory of incorporeals, and I'm not competent to discourse on the Stoic theory of incorporeals, but it's one of the most kind of characteristic features. We find him holding to I guess what might be considered kind of philosophical currents of the day. But what's interesting is that he doesn't simply embrace a particular school. At one point, he'll criticize the Platonists, and another time, he'll be more accepting. It depends. So there's the evidence is easier to find in the prose works, I think in part because they're longer, and they also are, I don't know if more straightforward to interpret is really the right way to put it, but they're at least more straightforward to interpret for many people because the format's more familiar, right? So his thought doesn't have to be as compressed. It doesn't have to be couched in symbolism in the same way as it is in his poetry. And so it just becomes like, imagine if all we had to figure out Gregory Nazianzen's theological ideas were his poems. I think it'd be harder because, some of his greatest theological work is really in his orations, and in the poetry, you're there's the constraints of the medium, of the format. Now, Ephrem is, I think, a much better rhetor in poetry than Gregory Nazianzen was. But it's still the case that it's just harder to read, and so it was. I think once people started paying more attention to the prose works, which have been known for some time, but they tended to get less attention because the poetry was just cool, like, and that was what is, I mean, rightly, that's his signature contribution, is his poetry. So you start looking in the prose works, it's easier to find the evidence of philosophical concepts, and a Stoic theory of sensation seems to be operating in some, at least parts of it. He has the idea that there are 7 senses rather than 5. That's another interesting feature, and that was a Stoic view. So these things, we find them when he has occasion to interact with people that are more philosophical. We find him, particularly like Bardaisan, who is known as the Aramean philosopher, or the philosopher of the Arameans. And so when he's interacting with Bardaisan's ideas, of course, he starts sounding more philosophical too, because he's engaging with some of these issues. I'm trying to think. There are a few other places where this gets discussed, but I ultimately still think that probably the most important contribution on this question is in Ute Possekel's book. So anybody that wants to kind of get all the juicy details of Ephrem's philosophical debts would find almost everything that they would want in that dissertation. At least, certainly, all the starting places. If you wanted to go read the originals.
Yeah. So really, I mean, it sounds like the picture you're painting is we have a really complex, like, nuanced thinker, really a creative thinker, and to try to just reduce him to some kind of like slogan. He's either way, like he's just a poet or he's an anti-intellectual, something like that, doesn't really capture him.
Yeah, I think you would have to have a very restrictive definition of what it means to be intellectual to think of Ephrem as anti-intellectual. Now, unfortunately, some people have a very restrictive definition of what it means to be an intellectual, which is why I think McLuhan turns out to be really helpful for reading Ephrem, but we'll get to that in a minute.
Yes. And I guess as a precursor then, so this is what I thought was really interesting in your chapter, is that you talk about his concept of cognitive activity. And you make this argument that for him, the aim or purpose or goal of our cognitive activities are to pursue wisdom. And I found that really interesting. So could you kind of unpack this idea and explain this for us?
Yeah, I've been working on this notion that Ephrem is really interested in the pursuit of wisdom almost since the beginning of my academic career.